Thank you very much. And in addition to thanking the organizers and Haris in person in general, I'm also thankful for being allowed to speak instead of Trulionis or Messiaen. Well, I know very little about the former, and I know a thing or two about the latter, so start with a series of paintings. So, add to this Hieronymus Bosch, Fra Angelico, Claude Monet, and many more. And this is just part of Olivier Messiaen's pictorial interests. Sometimes he would directly invoke a certain painter or painting, like in this case. Let's Okay, he describes this music as cold and strange, like egg-shaped heads of the Kiriko. But above all, what attracted him was color. He composed with both sounds and colors in his mind. Everything in his music is connected with color. When I hear music, says Messiaen, colors move with the music, and I sense these colors in an extremely vivid manner. My modes have neither a tonic nor a final, neither melodies nor harmonies. They are colors. The same applies to their transpositions. A mode can change color when transposed. The same applies to chords, their spacing, the permutation of tones. All these can have coloristic effects. Harmonies associated with melody color the melody rather than harmonize it. Messiaen translates color into harmonies for those, says Paul Griffiths, who have ears to see. Messiaen further elaborates this by stating that color comes from a choice of chromaticism. If you play a cluster, you play all the notes at once and there are no colors. You get gray or black, colors are absent. To produce colors, you must suppress something. For example, if you're wearing, say, a yellow-orange sweater, then color absorbs certain rays and reflects others. It is the same with a chord. If you have 11 notes out of the 12, or 10 notes out of the 12, that produces a color. The 12-note row yields grayness, neutral color. Of course, synesthesia is a well-documented phenomenon, albeit infrequent and insufficiently understood. Apart from Trulionis, Ligeti, Sibelius, Scriabin, and Rimsky-Korsakov have been credited with this ability. And the latter two try to systematize their sound color perceptions. Like this, now like this, now like this. All research suggests that subjectivity of synesthesia. Little has been established by way of regularities, patterns, or consistency of results, and there are conflicting data even concerning a single composer. Now, Sept Haikai and Couleur de la Cité Céleste are two scores in which the colors are explicitly named in the score. First of all, we'll listen to a brief excerpt. So we have colors indicated in the score, and well, it could be something like this, not very well made, but anyhow. Okay, that's for the next one. The subjectivity I mentioned means that even the synesthetes among us could hardly expect to perceive these same colors. Some 40 years ago, Jonathan Bernard analyzed and systematized Messiaen's modally based coloration. He has interesting observations about Messiaen's color modes. Not all modes in Messiaen are colored. And he attempted to relate their coloristic properties to their pitch or pitch class structure, inclusion relations, and common tones between various modes. He identified and tabulated correlations between sound and color, highlighting the role of the absolute pitch, vertical spacing, and more. For her part, Jeanne-Marie Vu points to the mixing of the colors obtained from combining tonalities and modes. F-sharp major and mode 2, octatonic scale, in Regard du cercle d'un enfant Jésus, from 20 Regards sur l'enfant Jésus. I'm not, however, going to pursue this line. What interests me now are the dazzling intensities of his color. Messiaen himself articulated a distinction between the delicate colors of Debussy, which are akin to the shimmering coloration of a Claude Monet, and the strong colors of his own language, which he compared to the violent color contrasts found in the paintings of Robert Delaunay. In his study on the Anglo-Irish painter Francis Bacon, Gilles Deleuze talks about color force, the immediate exercise of force by means of color. This is what Messiaen's colors are all about. With his violent colors, Messiaen produces shock and dazzlement, éblouissement. The ideal listener comes to a performance without prior beliefs, so as to receive a shock of the positive. Shock as an intrusion of external and overwhelming stimuli is a desirable effect, and it could well be a central component of Messiaen's aesthetics. Timothy Cochrane describes musical dazzlement as a jolting experience of truth, a sudden change from the stasis of rational thought to an overpowering, almost violent confrontation with glory. Or in Andrew Shenton's words, a report so powerful that it can transform our most hidden, deepest, most intimate self and dissolve it into a higher truth. In Messiaen's own words, it is an internal perception of colors analogous to that produced on the eyes by the stained glass windows of great Gothic cathedrals, something terrible and sacred of which we do not comprehend the detail, something that carries us into a world where the light is too strong for our reasoning. A break towards the beyond, towards the invisible and unspeakable, which may be made by means of sound color and is summed up in the sensation of bedazzlement. As a child, he himself was bedazzled with the stained glass of Saint-Chapelle. It was a shining revelation. With this, we are entering the realm of Messiaen's highly personal theology. The light of stained glass windows is beyond time and space. Its musical suggestions are an appropriate depiction of God who is beyond times and space. Messiaen's intense sensitivity to color is part of his spiritual perspective, which infuses the glare, brightness, layering, and light of color with a longing for the single immutable truth, light of truth. Thomas Aquinas will call this the dazzled excess of truth. It is no coincidence that one of the biblical passages to which Messiaen frequently refers, the Apocalypse, is characterized by unrestrained color. It is a profession of faith in color, the language of mystical love in multicolored arrangements. Messiaen classifies, let me see, okay. Messiaen classifies his music into the categories of liturgical music, religious music, and sound color and bedazzlement. I put colored music above liturgical music and religious music. Liturgical music celebrates God in his dwelling place, in his church. Religious music discovers God at every hour and everywhere on our planet Earth. But colored music does that which the stained glass windows of the Middle Ages did. They give us bedazzlement. Touching at once our noblest senses, hearing and vision, it shakes our sensibilities into motion, pushes us to go beyond concepts, to approach that which is higher than reason and intuition, that is faith. How he connects his extraordinary sensitivity to color with spirituality is well illustrated by the following description of the Shinto temple on the Miyajima Island, an island, a hill covered with dark green Japanese pine and red maple leaves in the autumn. A Shinto temple, white and red. In the blue sea, opening toward the invisible, that is the true temple, is a huge red portico or torii. It is toward the second temple that the torii should lead us, if we know how to listen to the colors of the beyond. Knowing that Messiaen never writes pure music, but is always very much concerned with scientific and philosophical theories, exotic cultures, or the natural world, we could easily mistake all this for tone painting, ekphrasis, or even accuse him of abusing music for some ideological purposes. This is definitely not what color and music are about. To begin with, the extra musical does not mean narrative. His Nativité du Seigneur or Ventre Gods, for example, do not recount the story of Jesus' birth. It is a contemplation of mysteries, not a narrative of events. Influences beyond music become part of the musical fabric. Messiaen's music is not representative, it is affective. In his Bacon study, Deleuze observes that non-representation is particularly suited to religious painting. God must not be represented. Therefore, lines, colors, and movements are freed from the demands of representation. Divine figures are wrought by a fantasy in which everything is permitted. With even stronger reasons, this applies to music. As my discussion has now taken a turn towards aesthetics, I find Deleuze particularly appropriate, primarily his study on Bacon, but also his collaborative work with Félix Guattari, A Thousand Plateaus and What is Philosophy. Not only did Deleuze create some of his concepts through direct references to Messiaen. I like to think about Deleuze's philosophy as generally musical, although at this time I cannot go into details as to why it is so. At the heart of Deleuze's aesthetics is an immediate coupling of material to sensation, which doesn't represent nor does it wait for a subject to interpret it as representation. This effectively dispenses both with the object it doesn't represent and the subject. Among the arts, music is especially credited with such immediacy. Sensation for Deleuze is vibration. Art is vibration, literally so when it comes to vibrating particles of air or the electromagnetic waves of visible light. Philosophy, science, and art share the vibratory force of the universe, of chaos, says Elizabeth Gross. You may now wish to question the relevance of the Bacon study, since it is not concerned with music. In addition, we are dealing with two very different artistic temperaments. Indeed, what could Messiaen's perfumed and rainbow-colored world, as it has been called, have to do with Bacon's monstrous vision of pain and distress? A devout Catholic and a devout atheist in his absurd and godless world. Well, there is color, for instance. Deleuze believes Bacon to be one of the greatest colorists since Van Gogh and Gauguin. Color painted by Bacon can be loud, violent, thick, penetrating. There is, of course, even in that respect, a dazzling difference between Messiaen's stained glasses and Bacon's uniform, motionless color, but somehow they both impart some timeless quality. Deleuze talks about music beginning where painting ends. We are now ready to discover an area of overlap. For Deleuze's Bacon, the question is how to paint sound, to paint the screen. And for Messiaen, working from the opposite direction, to render color audible. The difference is, of course, that Messiaen allows us to see and partake in all blisses of salvation. Bacon lets us hear all the horrors of damnation. A Messiaen with the opposite sign, as it were. To return to this important aspect of non-representation, as we have emphasized, with Messiaen, and Bacon for that matter, it is not about representing or telling a story. Paul Klee says, and Deleuze likes to quote it, the painter's task is not to render the visible, but to render visible. It is sensation itself made visible, to harness the cosmic forces, to render invisible forces visible and inaudible forces audible. This is the task common to the painter, the musician, and the writer. In this respect, Deleuze's distinction between figuration and figure is crucial. Figuration refers to a form that is related to an object it is supposed to represent. The figure is the form that is connected to a sensation and that conveys the violence of this sensation directly to the nervous system, avoiding the detour of telling a story. What is painted on the canvas is the body, not insofar as it represents an object, but insofar as it is experienced as sustaining this sensation. For Bacon, painting is the pattern of one's nervous system projected directly on the canvas. Only through such an understanding can we meaningfully talk about figures in music as something that sustains pure sensation, celestial, terrestrial, or infernal, religious sentiment made possible by a liberation of figures freed from figuration. And this is why, when we think of the visual aspect of Messiaen music, we don't think so much of lines delineating a person, an object, a bird, but pure, disembodied, subjectless, and objectless, dazzling color. The further it is removed from retelling, describing, or portraying, the closer it is to immediate mystical experience. But then the question arises, what of us who are not believers? It may be surprising that I will first invoke psychoanalysis, of which Deleuze was highly critical. Messiaen proclaimed that he loathed it, and even Francis Bacon wasn't very fond of it. I grant this. But then psychoanalysis makes good sense, for music being of all arts closest to the unconscious, preverbal primary process, which dominates the mental functioning in early infancy. At that developmental phase, the world is chiefly represented through sound. The visual comes later, and with development of the verbal conceptual apparatus, we are well into the secondary process. This is a Freudian orthodoxy, but I believe it does explain a great deal. At the moments of the so-called aesthetic peak experience, induced by music more often than by any other art, we are as if transported to the primary oceanic state of early infancy, in which we experienced a sense of permeation between ourselves and the external world. We are indeed one with the world. Our personal boundaries dissolve. There is no subject and object. We merge with the work. As T.S. Eliot writes in 4 quartets, you are the music while the music lasts. Messiaen dissociates colors from objects, infuses it with sound, renders it pre-object, pre-personal, hence once with music, hence complicit in achieving the state similar to what I just described, and which for Messiaen was mystical. Thus, even for a non-believer, there is a sense of revelation, only not one involving transcendence. Again, in Deleuzean terms, perhaps you are closer to the idea of chaos. This chaos is not a nothingness, but a virtual containing all possible particles and drawing out all possible forms. Not a disorder, but a plethora of orders. Art takes a bit of chaos and puts it into frame in order to form a composed chaos that becomes sensory, say Deleuze and Guattari. Elsewhere, they use the enigmatic phrase, becoming imperceptible. What I believe it means is that we are no longer disengaged from life and difference, and by becoming one with the flow of images that is life, we are no longer perceived as an entity apart from the flow of life. This entails imagining life from a non-human perspective. After all, Messiaen transcended God, and Deleuze's plane of immanence are not necessarily irreconcilable. There is something pantheistic about Messiaen. It is something like natura sive deus, as per Spinoza, whose avid reader was Deleuze himself. We can visualize the transcendent as vertical, but the power of artistic creation effectuates its rotation, bring it to the plane of immanence, which expresses the mineral, the animal, the human, the cosmic, and the divine, all in the same voice. Both color, if we conceive it in the way Messiaen does, and sound prove to be potent agents of achieving this.
Thank you, Miloš, so much. We see here an experienced talker. It was exactly 20 minutes. So questions? Then I will start the discussion. Miloš, could you please explain me? I'm very interested. How did you approach? I contacted you and I gave you a guideline considering the topic of the conference. And then I see this marvelous result. I'm very interested, how was the creative process to this? How did you get the idea and how did you develop this idea that you have?
Well, as you well known, as we are both composers, the most difficult thing is to explain the creative process, whether composing or writing a paper. But certainly, Messiaen it has been for quite a while, one of my interests. I've always been interested in examining relationships between various arts, particularly music and literature, but then I, for some other reasons previously, got interested in this music connections with pictorial arts. So it sort of gathered from here, from there, and then of course I like reading this and that. So I also read all these references that I mentioned and many more that I couldn't mention in such a presentation, but they're there on the list. So I cannot really trace exactly this process, but it sort of brews slowly and then yields some results.
Thank you so much. Just to bring a little bit in context, several paintings of Ciulionis will travel 2026 to Japan for an exhibition. Further questions?
Labai ačiū už įdomią temą. Aš tik tai galvoju, kaip iš to, ką jūs rodėt, ir tiesiog dar ką pasiūlyčiau tyrinėjant. Bet tai čia žinoma, žinot, kas prancūzų tradicijoje buvo, reiškia, Charpentier, toksai teoretikas, kuris sudarė tonacijų ir afektų atitikimų lentelę. Yra ir daugiau, reiškia, labai būtų įdomu pažiūrėti per afektus, kokia tonacija iš prancūziškos tradicijos Messiaenui galėjo veikti, nes tonacija susieta su afektu, konkrečiu afektu. Ir paskui dar man, jūs šito žodžio neminėt, bet sinestezija yra jau pasenęs terminas, yra ekfrazės teorija. Ekfrazės tai yra vieno meno vertimas kito meno pagalba. Pažiūrėkite šitą teoriją. Ekfrazė. Tai aš jums tiesiog siūlau afektų teoriją susipažinti Charpentier ir ekfrazės teoriją. Tiesiog papildyti. nes, nu, negirdėjau, bet tai labai įdomu būtų ir galbūt papildytų dar. Ačiū labai jums.
Thank you for the suggestion. I haven't really studied this earlier. I know something about, I've heard this in the 18th century. There was something I believe even Rameau was concerned with that. Look, I'm not getting into that. I mean, I may later say something wrong. Synesthesia, I think, is a legitimate term in psychology. And I'm using that exclusively in that relation. I use the word ekphrasis when I was trying to delimit the area in which Messiaen's music best connects with color or with this visual sensation, whether it's ekphrasis or representation or narration or something. So I was in that context is okay, but synesthesia is a psychological term for people who are able to experience, and that's how I actually use it.
No. Do you know or no?
Well, like Ziegenbrunn, for example, I'm familiar with Ziegenbrun's study about ekphrasis. What was the title of her article? A Concert of Painting, I believe. So yeah.
So we go towards.
My line of reasoning is somewhat different from that. I'm sort of arguing something else. Okay.
So we have time for a short question,
Very short.
a last short question.
Okay, thank you for your interesting topic and presentation. And my question is that we can see that different authors, for example, those who have these synesthetical qualities, yeah, they imagine tonalities in different ways. Could you see some, when you compare, do they come to agreement sometimes, or just it's a personal system?
I don't think I need to go back to these slides of Scriabin and Rimsky-Korsakov. I think that when they agree, it might be purely coincidental. It is highly subjective, and I don't think that, I don't know whether anyone among the audience here has these synesthetic abilities. But I don't think that any of us would really agree with Messiaen on that. And then there are some people like Ligeti for whom we are not quite sure, but from what we know, I mean, I personally met his son, and he claims that George Ligeti was a synesthete. He never makes any specific connections, but just some vague impression of having visual sensations along with music. So I think it's very subjective, and so far we cannot establish any pattern.
Thank you so much.